All right. Hello and welcome. And thank you for joining us today and taking the time to be present with us during this course live as opposed to a video recording for those of you that can make it. So today we are going to be talking about saints and sainthood in Islam. And to that end, let's begin with this quote from the Quran that says, "The friends of God, for them there is no fear, and neither do they grieve." Now let me try and explain that quote to you. Let's jump ahead a couple of slides, and then we'll go back. So the origins of this quote are from Quran 10:62 to 63, and it talks about in the Nasr translation for the study Quran. It says, "Behold, truly the friends of God, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. Those who believe are reverent." And this term that is used in the Quran is wali in the singular and awliya in the plural. And this friend of God, what do we mean by the word friend of God? So, uh, in a hadith that is a fair hadith. Now, just one thing that's kind of important to keep in mind is when we're talking about the hadith traditions, we're usually going to talk about the classification systems used by the Sunnis, and in this case, this is from Adab al-Mufrad, which is the kind of manners. The assessment of this hadith is fair, which is to say, so when hadith evaluators, especially those like Muslim and Bukhari, about 200 years after the death of Muhammad, this is just to reiterate a point we've been making throughout, Muhammad's sayings have proliferated to the point that they have become almost useless, that there's a saying on almost every subject and every purpose. And so the hadith transmitters in the about 2.5 centuries after the death of Muhammad need to sift through this tradition to figure out what is authentic and what is inauthentic. And part of that sifting is giving grades to these hadith. Now, again, we have a little bit of complexity when we're talking about Sufism, because Sufis may classify as hadith things that saints have encountered in their mystic experiences with God. Now, let's just put a kind of an asterisk at the end of that, because Shia similarly will have an expanded notion of hadith, which will include the declarations of the 12 infallible imams. All right. So there's these multiple categories of what constitutes hadith, but in this case, this comes from a Sunni tradition. And it says here, and hadiths often have this chain, the silsila at the beginning, saying where did it come from? So Asma bint Yazid reports that the Prophet, Allah may peace bless him, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, "Shall I tell you who is the best of you?" Yes, they replied. And he said, "Those who remind you of Allah when you see them." Now, many Sufis have interpreted that portion. Now, this is half of the hadith. There's more on it later because this is in the book of manners. So it also deals with bad manners. But the first part of this hadith, what it is talking about, is something that the saints will often claim for themselves. They'll claim that they are a living remembrance of God. The idea is that when you see them, the word in Arabic is zikr or dhikr, and the idea is remembrance of God is part of the relationship between creator and creation. So in the Quran, the relationship is implied in terms of remember me and I will remember you. So memory in that case is where the kind of sin of humanity lies, is that they forget to remember God. So in this rendering, it says that there are going to be reminders even ever present in the community around you. And when you look upon certain people and how they are remembering or how they are signposts of the divine, then that in and of itself reminds us to maybe intensify our practice or improve it. All right. So in In the study Quran, it refers the description of the surah. It says, the friends of God in this specific case are thus a unique group of individuals who, because they have conquered their egos and are in perpetual proximity to God, are totally consumed by Him. And this definition is drawing a little bit of some of Ibn Arabi's concepts, and we're going to be going over some of those later in this class. Okay. So right up at the front, one of the things that you're going to notice that we've done in every class is we've always begun with the Quran or the Hadith traditions and how it ties into what we're talking about today. And you're going to notice in the textbook with Carl Ernst that he's more or less doing the same thing. That the Sufis themselves would have debates about what the limits of permissibility are, what is acceptable and unacceptable, and they would come up with these definitions and these engagements of the tradition based on their nuanced readings of the text. So, in the case of the current hadith and the current surah under discussion, they interpreted friends of God to refer to the saints or those who have had experience of God, all right? Or i.e., consumed by the experience. Now, one of the problems when we're talking about sainthood is that we often butt up against the categories of sainthood in Catholicism in particular, but in Christianity more generally. And again, one of the reasons why we have to negotiate this ground is because when the colonizers are arriving in places like India and places like Palestine and places like Egypt, they are encountering saints' shrines, and then they're trying to compare it to the kinds of saint shrines you may find in Europe. But the process with how sanctification works in Catholicism, in Roman Catholicism, my apologies, is a little bit specific to the tradition. So, Roman Catholicism is highly bureaucratic in its structure, right? Um, and the requirements for sanctification are first. So let's say, for example, you believe that there has been a saint in Halifax, and we want to have this person sanctified. So, first step we would do is we would submit a petition for sanctification with supporting materials. And in the case that you wanted to do it effectively and efficiently, you may even want to contact a canon lawyer to help you with this process, someone who's trained in the canon juris canonicum. Then the next step is once you've submitted the report, on the side of the church, there will be an investigation there has to be a letter also submitted in your application by a bishop, and then an investigation will be conducted by the church itself as to whether or not this person should be elevated to this level. The next stage is beatification, where the considerations will be made as to how they were killed or how they died. Were they martyred? Were they killed doing something faithful? So were they preaching when someone should gun them down, perhaps? And then, in addition, there would need to be a miracle associated with the person who's assuming sainthood. So something miraculous would happen. Something like a crying statue might be a pretty typical miracle, or a healing, or that kind of thing would be tend to be associated, and that is proved by attestation of the community. Um, then for canonization, there must be additional miracles associated with the saint after the death of the saint and after the beatification of the saint. At that stage, the person would then be elevated to formal sainthood and then would become a kind of canonical saint. All right. Here I have an image on the left of Saint Xenia of Petersburg, just to remind me that sanctification is different in the Eastern Orthodox churches and in the Roman Catholic churches, which is why we have to be specific. The word Catholic means universal. We should not be saying Catholic. We should be saying Roman Catholic to be as specific as possible. So Eastern Orthodox churches here have different processes for sanctification. And the kinds of saints that we see in the Eastern Orthodox Church are usually the saints that are inspired by the biblical phrase, fools for the sake of Christ. And in that idea, this holy foolishness, in the case of Russia, it would be the Yerodve, would be our holy fools. The famous onion domes are dedicated to Saint Vasily. But here's another saint, and Saint Zania. She's rather famous because in her 20s, her husband dies in a war, and she's attested to be in the 18th, 19th century. Her husband dies in a war, and she starts wearing his clothes and performing as him and playing with her gendered pronouns in the city of St. Petersburg. And as the clothes begin to fall off her body, she keeps building it out of a patchwork of new clothing. She is known for being very rigorous in her prayer and having taken a vow of poverty and given everything material away. And so she's sort of sanctified by the community for her incredible piety and also her particular kind of preference for the poor. But as you can see in the little Italian phrase under her, traduttore, traditore, it means to translate is to betray. So when we're talking about sanctification and saints in the Catholic traditions or in the Eastern Orthodox traditions, they are not going to necessarily be the same in Islam. However, when scholars arrive in the newly colonized world, they will often use these categories when they're looking at the phenomena in front of them. So there has been a lot of scholarship in the last 150 to 200 years about saints and how they are or are not similar to what occurs in the Roman Catholic, in the Eastern Orthodox, and the Syriac traditions. And so there is a big sort of debate over what this constitutes. And what complicates the debate much more is the fact that often saint shrines were not exclusive to a singular tradition. So often, a saint's shrine, for example, would be revered by the Muslim community, would be also prayed at by the Jewish community, would also be prayed at by the Christian community, especially in places like Palestine, where you would have had a reasonable overlap of all three. Okay, so that's where our categories are a little bit significant. And what matters when it comes to Islam is that there is no formal process of sanctification. So, without a formal process by which someone can become a saint in Islam, how then does Islam have a cult of the saints, or how are there saints if saints are not sanctified or canonized in the same means? In general, our suspicion is that saints are expressions of varieties of popular religion that exist on the local level. So, if you were to take a snapshot of the Islamic Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, very few villages, for example, would have a mosque. Almost none. Major cities, of course, would. Most villages would not. However, almost every single village, according to Ottoman records, would have some kind of saint shrine. So that would become the locus of and the focus of all of the worship activity that would take place in the community. So if there was communal prayer, it would be done near this in the mausoleum of the saint. Or if there was to be a festival celebrated, so for example, the birthday of the prophet, which is a very popular event in the pre-modern period, if that was being celebrated, it may be celebrated at the shrine of the saint. And so these, the localization of the tradition as represented by the cults of the saints would be something that we would encounter quite commonly throughout the Muslim world. But if we say then, if every village, sort of every neighborhood has their own saint, how can we sift true from false? How can we sift real from fake? And these sort of questions inevitably bubble to the surface. And what the tendency is, at least as far as the tradition goes, in some cases, um, thank you for that question, Robert. I'll get just to that in one sec. In some cases, what would happen would be some communities would say that this person is a saint, and later, if if the saint's shrine remained popular, it would survive. But if the saint's shrine did not remain popular, it would fade. And also, with the expansion of the modern state under the Ottoman Empire, there was now a formalization process beginning to come in, where the Ottomans would mark them, would register them for taxation purposes, and others would also want to decide who the lineage was of the saint. So, in the case of a saint dying in your village, the saint, in many cases, may even have had family. So, if the saint has sons and children, and sons in particular are important for writing the hagiographies of the saint, so the history of the life of the saint, including their miracles, would have been often recorded by their family, and then their family would become the guardians of the shrine in a subcategory of Islamic property law called Awqaf law or Waqaf law, is the idea of creating charitable endowments for the purpose of maintaining a site. That was pretty rare in general in terms of the law, but there was this special exception made for these charitable endowments because often the shrine might also be a place of learning and education. Now, as to this question in the chat about whether there's going to be a differentiation between Shia and Muslim saints, again, Robert, I suspect that that is going to be a question of recognition. So, if a Shia saint um, is in a village in Konya, for example, um, and Sunnis and Shias both go to the shrine, and a debate comes up. Well, is he a Sunni or a Shia saint? As long as there are miracles associated or something special associated with that tomb, it may not matter because the saint's ability and power is about their being connected to this community and this locale. So if you're connected to that community, I think irregardless of you being Sunni or Shia, you may go there for festivals and events and what have you. Um, the other thing that's significant here is when, if there's no formalized system by which someone becomes a saint, is it possible that Christian saints get Islamified? Is it possible that Hindu saints become Islamified in time? And the answer to that is absolutely, right? That would obviously be taking place as well, because essentially saint shrines would be points of sanctification within small localized communities. In the expansion over time, especially with the expansion of so-called Wahhabi Islam, there has been a massive pushback against this popular form of religiosity. And in many cases, saint shrines have been destroyed, especially in places like Saudi. And that kind of impulse to level has extended to things like the mausoleum of Prophet Muhammad himself, which was destroyed in the 20th century. So when and where the fear that prompts those sort of destructions is because the idea in Islam, or in some varieties of Islam, of shirk or bid'ah, the idea is there's a nervousness about one, innovation, so making something new of the religion, which maybe isn't in the religion, is a thing that would make especially conservative voices nervous. Secondly, shirk, the idea that you would make something else God that is not God, is the question of idolatry in Islam. And in the case of the saints, because saints were often associated with things like intercession, which is to say, you would pray to the saint to intervene for you on Judgment Day, because their shrines were associated with things like that, which were suspect as far as the tradition is concerned. Um, as a result, there was a tendency to see this as a cultic or engaging in this form of shirk. And so, for the Wahhabis who brought state power and military power to this unease, there was a tendency, especially, to destroy the saints' shrines they would argue, as a safeguard against false faith. But to those of us who are historically minded, seeing the sort of beautiful historical things destroyed because of a reinterpretation feels like a wound. All right. Um, John Coleman, in a typography of saints across multiple traditions, has the following to say about them. This is returning to the slides. In the first case, saints will often be moral exemplars. And what is meant by that is that they will be excellent examples of how to be a good Muslim. So they will be reserved, they will be careful, they will be pious, they will be sort of praying, recognized by their community as being an imitable model of moral behavior. With a caveat. In some cases, saints in places like Europe may also engage in mortification activities like self starvation. So, in the case of some European female mystics, they would render their body androgynous by starving themselves. So, if a woman was to starve herself, her breasts would shrink, she would stop menstruating, and her body would start looking androgynous at the point of being skeletal. And women were engaging in acts such as that as acts of becoming saints. They're being associated with miraculous acts and what have you, wearing hair shirts and being mendicants. And so those kinds of activities were familiar to places like Europe. But the difference was in Islam is that you have to keep in mind that Muhammad, the Prophet, is arguing that his people are a people of the middle way. So the extremes that Syriac church fathers, such as Saint Simeon sitting on his pillar in the desert, and others would engage in, would be considered too far. So in Islam, it's very notable that we do not have formal monastic movements developing in something like Islam, something like uh, the Franciscans or the Benedictine monks. There's nothing quite like that in Islam. However, what we do have is Sufi lodges that may practice their own forms of renunciation, but not in on the formal level of the church. Again, which is going to be involved in taxation, which is going to be involved in the control of lands and what have you. That is not going to be the same between Islam and Christianity. Another thing that saints are often well known for is being teachers in their lives. So, after reaching a certain stage of enlightenment, they may engage in teachings and have a large number of students that would join them. This is again something quite typical of learned people in the pre modern period. You have to keep in mind the literacy rates are going to be extremely low. So, places where you can go and learn the Quran, learn the traditions, engage with the teacher, have them teach, give you lessons, that would be something quite important. And so, saints are often associated with teachings and these sort of learnings as well. In addition, saints in different cultures would often be associated with miracles or wonders. Um, in some cases, like I said, crying statues, milk that gets miraculously consumed by a figure, or in other cases, healings. Now, if you were to look at a country like India or Pakistan, there would be different saint shrines that you would go to for different issues in the pre-modern period and to a certain extent in the modern period too. So, for example, if you were suffering from erectile difficulty as a man, there may be a saint shrine where you can go and pray, and that saint is meant to help get a rise out of you, or you just pray to the saint of Pfizer and get a blue pill, right? Like that's the that's the other option in the super modern period. But in the past, you may go to a saint shrine and you would pray because that saint has some special ability in that particular area of life. And often this sort of information is recorded anecdotally. Although, in the case of places like India and Pakistan, you'll find manuals available on the street level, which will tell you which saint shrines to go to for what issue. Another area where saint shrines are considered particularly important in the Islamic world is dream interpretation. So, for example, if you had a dream and you have a suspicion that it's a prophetic dream or that someone is trying to tell you something in that dream, a saint shrine like Imam Ghazali's shrine in Egypt is somewhere where you would go and there would be scholars sitting on the steps outside the shrine. I don't know in COVID times how this works, but pre COVID, there would be guys sitting outside and you could go to them and tell them your dream and they would interpret it for you using the scholarship of the saint school and their own analytical methods. So that's something you would go for to a saint shrine. Another area, and this is the most kind of suspect area in Islamic law, at least, is the idea of intercession. So, in some cases, Shias were accused of praying to Ali, for example, instead of praying to God for intercession on Judgment Day. The breakdown you have to understand in the pre-modern period is the idea that you want to communicate with God. The Quran is created so you can communicate with God. Again, this is a let's say you're a Muslim in the 17th century, so you want to communicate with God, and engaging the Quran is important for communicating with God. Um, and your teacher is someone who's claiming to have revelation in their dreams. In addition, they know the Quran very well. They're a very sophisticated learner. In time, the community may even start asking them for prayers on their behalf. So they would say, "Hey, would you pray for me? My grandmother is sick." Then the saint dies. People would keep praying for the saint and asking for the saint's intercession in their personal lives. And in addition, a very rich anecdotal culture would tend to develop around the shrine of a saint, which would say, "Oh, so and so prayed for this intercession, and they saw a vision of the saint in their dream, and the saint helped them." So often, intercession stories will accompany a typical saint's kind of the milieu of things that a saint is involved in. All right, and again, this is considered highly suspect, especially because the Quran, in a number of places, makes the point that reliance on anything but God is a mistake. But many people see the intercession of saints being commensurate with reliance on God as opposed to incommensurate with reliance on God, if that makes sense. The idea is that if God loves this person, and if the Quran itself refers to these people as the awliya Allah, the friends of God, then maybe I can ask God's friend to put in a good word for me on Judgment Day. That's the idea, right? So that you would ask for someone to give God a nudge, and if you were growing up in and around the cultures in the Middle East and South Asia, you would know that having someone put in a word for you is worth more than anything else, right? Like you can have all the right documents, all the right paperwork, and you show up at the office to get some form done. You need your shinakhti, your ID card, or something like that. You show up at the office, but having a contact on the inside, makes all the difference in the world. So this kind of bureaucratic idea of Judgment Day is kind of reaffirmed a little bit in the Quran as well. The idea that you have two angels sitting on your shoulders that are recording all of your deeds in life, and there's going to be an accounting when you get to Judgment Day. This sense is this kind of bureaucratic sophistication of heaven and the afterlife would lead people to think maybe I should put in a good word with a saint. It wouldn't hurt. That's the kind of that seems almost to be a good idea. And for the Shia, to a lesser extent, the Imams, again, if they are considered awliya Allah, then maybe you should be asking them for a hand too, or asking them for help as well. Again, uh, for a lot of Muslims, this violates the primacy in the Quran of not relying on anything but God. But that for the people that believe in the cults of saints, they don't see that as diverting their attention from God. It's just asking for, like a bribe on the side from a friend, that kind of thing. Okay. The question of austerity and poverty. Often saints were also associated with taking vows of austerity and poverty. It did not go quite often in the extremes that it did in places like India. In India, saints may have copied or at least modified practices of sadhus, for example, in Hinduism, who would themselves take vows of poverty, or Buddhists who would also take vows of poverty and become a bhiksu, a wandering monk who would go from village to village, begging for food and sustenance. In the same kind of way, in a place like India, because that sort of saintly culture was established, there was a high likelihood that Muslims just mapped Islam onto the same kind of practices which were performed there. There's incidentally in the question and answer from the open chat, someone has posted a beautiful poem, and I recommend you take a look at it. Um, in addition, the vows of poverty often meant simply that you were reliant on sustenance in the community. Now, in the case of Buddhism, again, a layperson, so a non monk, an outsider to the community, would earn merit. By giving a monk food. So, by giving the Buddha or a local monk uh, some rice balls and some fish or what have you, would be how you would earn merit for yourself outside of the community. And again, in Buddhism, you're trying to accumulate merit, or in Hinduism, you're trying to accumulate merit so that your path on your dharma, your way, is kind of better. So in the cycle of birth and rebirth, you would ascend in rank until you could eventually leave the wheel entirely. So austerity and poverty is important amongst saints, but not maybe as extreme as the sadhus or the bhikshus, and more of the variety that, if we were to think back to that phrase we had quoted before, which is, if you don't own anything, then nothing can own you, right? That kind of perspective. Okay. In addition, the last thing about the saints is they were said to have a special relationship to the holy, and that we're going to elaborate on a bit in the next few slides. Okay. Every one on the same page here. We're feeling good about where we are so far. Okay. Some head nods. All right. All right. Good. 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 Okay, so just to reiterate, we're going to talk about a Hadith Qudsi again. This is just a slide from an earlier class where we discussed the Hadith Qudsi. And again, the kind of justification and validation of these Hadith Qudsi. They often don't make it into the larger collections of Sunni Hadith, but they have been circulated rather popularly. And so, for example, in the 16th century, assessment of the hadith, this scholar of hadith claims that the words of God come in three forms. The first and most honored is the Quran, which is the most eloquent and miraculous. This form is immune to changes and distortions, every letter of it equal to 10 letters of other words, and it's superior to the other words of God, i.e., previous traditions. The second form consists of the books of the earlier prophets before they were distorted. The third form refers to those words of God known as Al Hadith Al Qudsiya. These are the form of individual or isolated narrations which the Prophet has narrated to us from his Lord. And the difference between these hadiths and kind of the hadiths usually that Muhammad says is Muhammad does not claim often to be speaking for God. But in the case of the Hadith Qudsi, they're almost always framed as God's speech. And so that's why they are subcategorized as this separate area, because if it's God speaking and if it's our prophet that we trust completely, then the words that God is speaking through his mouth have some special weight and value, arguably, right? And so that's the space that the Hadith Qudsi operates in, and but often for again more conservative scholars who are trying to sift the tradition for the most validated sort of stuff. Um, the Hadith Qudsi create a problem as well for them because there's no guarantee of their being unaltered in the way that the Quran claims to guarantee that it's unaltered in and of itself. Also, the preservation of the Quran is seen as an imperative early on in the tradition, and the Hadith kind of collecting and sifting through them happens only about 200 years later. Okay. So the hadith that we had quoted last time and is translated by Omid Safi in his book of poetry on radical love is I was a hidden treasure and I yearned and I loved to be known intimately. So I created the heavens and the earth so they may know me. And this relationship between the divine and creation is like in James Tissot's image on the right, is like someone searching for a hidden treasure that wants to be found. And so the seekers on the path would be us, and the treasure would be God in this case. And God desires for us to use all of our faculties, all of the tools, all of the revelation to seek God. Is the argument of a hadith like this. Here is another one, and this one is quoted in Karl Ernst's book that we're looking at for our text. It says here, "My servant draws near to me through nothing I love more than the religious duty I require of him. And my servant continues to draw near to me by supererogatory worship until I love him. And then when I love him, I become the ear by which he hears, the eye by which he sees, the hand by which he grasps, the foot by which he walks. If he asks me for something, I give it to him. If he seeks protection, I provide it to him." All right, let's take a look at this a bit more closely. Again, the speaking in this case is meant to be the speech of God, as narrated by Muhammad and preserved in these traditions called the Hadith Qudsi. You would have collections of them within about 150 years of Muhammad's death. You had some collections of about 40, some go as high as 100. And again, in the Sufi communities, these are considered extremely important because of just this sort of material. So here in this hadith, we have a sense of a stage path, right? So, what are the paths of the stage of becoming a Sufi? And they would find, or not just a Sufi perhaps, but a saint. What we find here is it says, "My servant draws near to me first through duty." And duty is often interpreted in this case as the Sharia. So the laws of God are the first stage of the path that you should follow the law. Um, and the Sharia, just as a reminder to those of us that may not be familiar with the term, the Sharia is often translated as Islamic law, but that's actually a pretty inaccurate translation. Islamic law is much broader. It's more like the ways that the Jews may be considered the people of the law. The law covers almost all aspects of life, which includes things like ibadat, so like prayer, how you wash your hands, how you cleanse yourself, the kinds of rituals you engage in, but also would include things like the Hudud ordinances in somewhere like Pakistan, which are actionable laws derived from the Quran, i.e., the lashing of an adulterer, for example. So the Sharia covers all of these bases, and a better way to think of Sharia than Islamic law is to think of it as all of the requirements for living an upright life as derived from the Quran and Sunnah by scholars and the community. So that's a much broader definition, but I think that's more useful when we talk about Sharia than merely talking about Sharia as an isolated band of the law. Like, for example, when the British were in India, they narrowed the scope of the Sharia to only include criminal law and marital law and wills, trusts, and estates. Everything else fell under the general law of the colony. So, in the case of certain crimes, such as blasphemy, that may be judged within the band of Sharia, but if it was something like, for example, stock trading or a bill of lading upon delivery of an item at a port, that would be judged by a law maritime or alternatively by appeal all the way up to the Star Chamber in England. So just to kind of reiterate, the Sharia is the first step of this path. So following and being a conforming member of that community, and then the next step is that supererogatory worship is additional prayer. So, for example, were you to complete the five daily prayers. Uh, Additional prayers beyond that are the supererogatory prayers, the extra ones that you're putting in. So it's saying on the first stage, do what the law asks of you, and you achieve goodies. Then, if you want to do extra stuff beyond what the law asks of you, then you will become my beloved, is the way that the hadith is setting it up. And then once you get to that point, once I love you and the veil has been lifted from your eyes and you see the really real, the reality behind the reality, often what's implied in Sufi metaphysics and cosmology is the idea that our world is an illusion. And in the case of the scape behind me, it's definitely an illusion, right? There's a green curtain back there. So if reality is an illusion, the dreamer, which is us, is trying, or sorry, we are an aspect of the dream, and our goal is to try and wake up. So, for example, if you were to look at a film like Inception, the layers of the dream, deeper and deeper and deeper into the dream, the idea is that's what we are encountering ourselves. So, when we see the world, we see it veiled. We don't see the really real behind it. We think that our suffering is finite, that we think the pain that we're experiencing now is real versus a test or versus an illusion. And so the idea is when you are awake to the really real, when the veil has been pulled from your eye, then you are infused with the spirit. And so the eye by which he sees, the hand by which he grasps, this implies almost that the servant or the friend of God gains a special way of looking at the world and engaging with the world. And whether or not that should be emulable by people who haven't had that is often a problem, as haven't had that divine encounter. But for the saints, the way that their actions are described is often in terms that they are acting out the code which is being put in them. If we were to think in terms of robotics. Okay, so that these are two hadith Qudsi that deal similarly with this question of the saint and who is the saint. And then let's talk about some of the subcomponents that are also mentioned in the chapter by Carl Ernst, but let me give you some additional material on this issue as well. So this question of miracle. Now, the image on the right that I have included here is the image of a miracle that was said to have taken place called the Miracle of Fatima in 1917 in Portugal. And this was associated with an appearance of Mary. Um, and also an intense flare up of the sun. And it was very heavily covered by the media. And so, if you were to look it up, you would find quite a bit of information on this. And the claim was that thousands upon thousands of people had gathered on this hill to experience this miracle, and then something actually happened, whether there was a bright flash of light or some sort of solar flare or whatever it was. Everyone in this crowd saw it, and it was heavily documented at the time as well. And so, and also, if you, the picture's a little bit unclear because of how old it is, but one thing you would notice is these are not necessarily wealthy people, right? So these are people dressed in roughshod clothing. They are in the if in a sharper version of this image, you could see that a majority of them are not wearing shoes, and often what you would find is shrines and miraculous occasions are a way of people reconstructing a sacred geography that allows them to complete some of the requirements of pilgrimage locally, i.e., visiting saint shrines because you might not be able to afford going to Mecca. And the argument might be that for you, in your local context, it may make sense for you to do that. Um, and again, if we remember back to the story of Mansur Halaj, that's one of the accusations of something that he does himself, which is why he's arrested, arguably, is that he builds a little Kaaba in the back, a little black box of Mecca in the back of his garden, and he says, "You can come and do your pilgrimage there." Which, if you want to piss off scholars in almost any era, that's the kind of thing you should be saying if you really want to make them very angry. Um, so that's one thing worthy of consideration as well, is that there's often a class dimension here as our discussions of Islam, is that the saint shrines are local. They're very modest. They're tiny. I'm going to skip ahead a whole bunch of slides, so just forgive me for doing that. Um, but here is a typical saint shrine. It's not fantastic. It's not beautiful. It's not heavily decorated. This is the Maqam al-Qatarwani in Palestine, and it's not like it. Yeah, it's just like a small brick dome, right? And it's old. It's not that well maintained, and this is typically what a saint shrine would look like. And during the birthday celebration of the saint, the Urs of the saint, or the Milad of the saint, depending where you are in the world, um, this would suddenly explode in sort of exuberance and excitement. And so people from all of the surrounding areas, regardless of religion in pre-modern times, would come to celebrate here. There would be song and dance and teachings of the saint, as well as consumption of festival foods and that sort of thing would be done here. So the additional point that I'm trying to make with regards to poverty and the kind of the everyday practice of people is often saint shrines provide an example of a readily available and easily accessible conduit uh, to the divine for everyday people. And so, whereas going to Mecca may be impossible for a poor person, going to the local saint's shrine might be very possible, right? Um, so when it comes to miracles, the Risala al-Kushairiya, which is written by a pretty famous Sufi treatise, a pretty famous manual, the master, it says here, the master Abdul Qasim al-Kushairi says that it is possible for God's friends to display miracles. The proof of the miracle's possibility is that it's something that can be conceived by the intellect and that its occurrence does not lead to suspension of any basic principle. Let me explain what he's talking about. All right. What he says when he is stating this is that God will not do anything ungodly. So, if God is just, God will not do an unjust act. So, in the example of the surah we were talking about in the last class, where Al Khidir shows up, the green sage, and he engages with Moses, Khidir does a bunch of stuff that seems unjust on the surface. He damages and sticks a hole in a boat. He murders a child that he encounters on the road, and he rebuilds a wall of a people who mistreats him. And the explanation is that it does not, none of his acts violated the idea of God's justice and mercy. And rather, there was a misapprehension on the part of Moses, i.e., on the part of the law, in understanding what this character was doing. And so the explanation here in this text of what is a miracle is something. Which also acts as kind of a confirmation. So, in the case of Kasharia, he will argue that the prophets do not necessarily have to perform miracles because the miracle is the fact that they're communicating with God directly. But for saints, that a miracle may actually act as a way of reaffirming the fact that they are a saint. Um, and so miracles in some cases, for example, there's a famous story of a Sudanese mystic Abdul Qadir, who removes his slipper and he whips it into the air, and it is said to hit a bandit in an oasis many miles away in the head and knock him down. And so that's the kind of miracle that may be associated. And so the question then would say, does this violate any of the laws of the divine? No, not really. Okay, so it conceivable that it could be a miracle, not whether or not it's conceivable in our rational tests, right? So, is it possible to throw a slipper from Halifax and hit someone in the head in Cape Breton? Unlikely, but conceivable, right? So that's kind of the line we're operating on, sort of the MythBusters potato cannon built on the Citadel to hit someone in the head with a slipper. I'd love to try it if anyone's interested. All right, you know that it. that slipper throwing story, it also became very important when George Bush visited Iraq, and he was giving a speech. And one of the journalists there got so upset that he took off his slipper and he tried to whip it at George Bush's head. And Bush, to his credit, ducked and dodged both sets of slippers. But that kind of story of the throwing of the slippers ties in with these stories of saints often throwing their slippers at devils or evil people or what have you. And so that story has become very, very popular in Iraq. And I would be really shocked if we don't see like a statue to a slipper somewhere in Iraq at some point in the future. So that you can see where a kind of cultic practice could develop from something like that. So Kasheri himself, he dies in the 11th century. He's a scholar in the Persian, and that shouldn't be Arabic, but should be Persian Arabic tradition or idiom. And he's very famous for his treatise on Sufism. This Risala Kasheriya fi ilm tasawwuf. It's literally um, the book or the study of by Sharia on the science or on the knowledge of Sufis, tasawwuf. Um, so Abdul Qasim, he writes this treatise on Sufism, which is very important and also contains a lot of meditations on definitions. So, what are the Sufi manual's definitions? How do Sufis understand themselves? And this becomes very popular in the genre of literature that's written by these kind of saints, where they're going to discuss uh, definitions as a part of Sufi practice, right? And here he's also going to write a very famous Quranic interpretation, which is going to further the same thing that we're saying about the Sufis, that they believe in inner meanings and inner understandings. And so he will say that the Quran has four kinds of knowledge. He would say first is Ibara, which is available to the mass of people, that anyone can engage and read the Quran. Second is Ishara, which is available to the spiritual elite who have studied and are learned. Next is lataif, which is the subtleties which the saints can understand in the text, which normal people may not get. And lastly is the haqaiq, which comes from the word haq or truth. And that's the prophets know the real truth in the text. And so this ranking of who can understand, who can see, and who can comprehend the text is something significant in these Sufi approaches as well. All right, moving on to this question of mystical experience. So another thing that's associated. Oh, wait, let me just pause. Any questions at this stage? Devin, I see you've got a question here asking, can I clarify the idea of praying to God to allow a saint or imam to intercede for them, but versus praying directly to the imam or the saint? Um, the idea is, let me try and explain this to the best of my ability, and forgive me if I make an error. But my understanding is that you are not praying to the saint directly instead of praying to God. The understanding is that you are doing a ricochet shot, right, in pool, that you are going to bounce it off one wall and get it in the pocket, but with the assistance of other balls that are already in place. Right. So the idea is that I'm going to have the people who are already guaranteed to be in heaven, who are already going to be sitting at the right hand side of God. I want them to start whispering my name. That's the idea. So the prayer would still be to God. It would still use the trappings of a normal prayer, but you would include the saint's name. So one form would be in the Shia form of the Shahada. It would be La ilaha illallah, Muhammadin Rasulullah, Aliyan Waliullah. So there is no God but God. Muhammad is God's prophet, and Ali is his friend. That would be the way of doing it, is that it's not uh, Ali only, but it's all of that would be included as in a list of a people I'm calling out to. Hopefully someone will hear my prayer. And that's the idea, is that if the assumption is that the infinite is busy or the infinite is incomprehensible, Ali is comprehensible. And so if I direct the prayer also towards the comprehensible and the incomprehensible. The comprehensible is satisfying to me, but the incomprehensible may hear it, inshallah, is the idea, right? So that's the kind of way I would look at intercession. But at the same time, there have 100% been saints who have claimed that if you pray to me and me alone, that I will save you. I will come and lift you up and take you. And that those kind of claims are ones that become pretty suspect, because that becomes uh, it'll become challenged by the scholars and by the legal scholars who already have a problem with these kind of activities. The legal scholars who would often have sway, especially in the government, at the highest echelons of government, would start complaining. And so eventually, someone in the government would have to do something if someone was claiming to be even a Mahdiist figure. So this is another thing that Halaj gets in trouble for, is that there's a claim at some point that he is the Mahdi. Now, the Mahdi, for those of us who may not know, that it's the idea that there's going to be some kind of redeemer that comes back. That after that, at the end of days, when we're going into the final cycle, there's going to be a redeemer who's going to come. Think of this as almost the return of Jesus in Christianity. Um, and in fact, in some Islamic schools, there's an idea that Jesus will return at the end of days as well, because he was, in the Muslim belief, as opposed to dying on the cross, Jesus is taken up in the similar manner as Elijah, that he's taken up and then is returned to speak to his apostles, but does not actually die on the cross. So for them, there's a number of movements in history, and we're going to refer to these movements as millenarian movements. Millenarian movements means that they're tied to 1,000-year cycles. One example of this is going to be in the 1850s, for example, out of a period of millenarian expectancy. So in a place like Iran at the time, or this is, I mean, in Persia at the time, um, there's a guy going around claiming to be the Bab. And the Bab and the literally means the door, right? And so he claims that he is the gateway to the prophets, and that the Imam, the Imam Mahdi, the kind of Imam in occlusion for the Shias, the one who's disappears. So the 12th Imam is taken up and disappears again, is in a state of spiritual separation from the world, and the people who communicated with this Imam in this kind of spiritual idea of communicating with him were called Babs. And in the 1800s, this Bab appears in Iran, and one of his followers is a guy who would come to call himself Baha'u'llah, and he would claim that he was a follower of the Babi religion, but now that he himself was the Mahdi. And so he had come as a reformer, and he claims to have received a new revelation in the form of the Kitabi Aqdas or the Kitabi Iqan, are the two kind of texts that he claims to have received. And so he claims that God is restoring the message of Islam because it has fallen into corruption. And so initially, his claims would kind of constitute sort of fitting within the fold of Islam, but in time, the Baha'is have especially asserted themselves as being a separate religion, and claim that they draw inspiration from Shia Islam, but don't claim to belong to it purely. So, in that kind of case, this millenarian expectation, the arrival of the Mahdi, for Muslims, it's meant to trigger all sorts of ideas. The end of days is coming. There's a period of reform. There's a period of self-disciplining that's required when the end of days trigger begins. Um, so, as a result, all of that expectation has often been claimed by various people who've tried to assume the mantle throughout history. A number of them have died under quite horrible circumstances, but in some cases, their movements survive. And so, similarly, with the Qadianis or the so called Ahmadiyya, theirs is also tied to a so-called Mahdiist figure in the form of, um, oh gosh, I'm going to forget his name. It'll come Ghulam Ahmad Khan from Qaidian. They'll claim that he is kind of a revitalizer of the tradition. And so, in the case of not like intercession as such, but these certain, they're claiming to be spiritual luminaries. Something that Muslims are meant to be expecting, but they're claiming it, and then they're claiming it as kind of reforming or reinterpreting or reanalyzing the law, and kind of being a light that reinterprets the tradition. And this is a contested claim in almost all cases where it's been asserted. All right. We are right about at 2. Let's take our 10. That'll give me a chance to get a cup of tea. And we'll be right back. I will pause the recording here and I'll resume when we return. Thanks, guys. I know this is a lot of material, but your faces tells me for the most part that you're coming along. So great. Okay. So for those of us who've made it back, thank you. Um, we're going to switch now to a bit of a discussion of mystical experience as it's understood by the various schools as well. And just to reiterate, a large part of what we would consider mystic experience is going to be tied into the prophet's own mystical journey. Where he is taken bodily from Mecca to Jerusalem, ascends through the seven heavens, and then returns. That incident is extremely important in our kind of understanding of mystical experience in Islam. Um, but we have some in from this that earlier text that I mentioned by Kardawi. We have the following kind of explanation of mystical experience as well. So this is the definition offered there. Um, as for the finding of God or wajud, it comes after one has raised oneself above ecstasy. The finding of the true reality can only happen after one's human nature is completely extinguished. And here I suspect it means the ego, the sense of self. For there is no place for it in the presence of the master of reality. Abu al Hassan al Nuri has said about this quote, "For 20 years I have remained between finding and losing, and that is when I found my Lord that I lost my heart, and when I found my heart I lost my Lord." What is meant by this kind of phrase here is that the idea of mystical union is something that's often sought by mystics. The idea that waiting until Judgment Day is a wait too long. That rather they want an encounter of the divine here and now. Is often a way of putting it. Um, and for them, the idea that you could experience God through mystical experience or dream is extremely important in Sufism, and particularly associated with saints and saint shrines. And so here it's saying that finding God is only possible after the ego is fully extinguished, because the self, let's switch to Buddhist terms because it might be a little bit easier to explain this. In Buddhism, Buddha has a realization that attachment is the source of suffering. Well, he has many realizations. His name literally means the enlightened one, right? Like the one who had lots of realizations. So his realization was that attachment leads to suffering. And what is meant by that is by, like, for example, if you are attached to your car and your car gets hit by someone else, the suffering that you feel is because of your attachment to the car. Or alternatively, if you are attached to someone you love and they break your heart and leave you, that the suffering that you feel is the suffering caused by attachment. So the way to end suffering, according to the Buddha, is that you would cease to be attached. cease to be attached to the things in the world, including also the attachment to the self. So often, for monks entering the Buddhist orders, they would shave off their eyebrows and their hair, and they would burn moxibustion marks in their forehead. And doing that, you were literally maiming your face to be unattractive, so that you wouldn't be attached to how you look. Is one of the things that they would do. Now, again, keep in mind that Islam is conscious of these practices in some cases, because that's considered one of the extremes. That's the monastic extreme. And so, in the case of the extinguishment of the ego for the Sufis, it often also meant an extinguishment of attachment. So, you get rid of material things that you may own. You may no longer live with your family. You may spend extensive periods of your life in travel and in meditation. So these would be the kind of acts that you would use to cultivate an escape. Incidentally, in the slide, you can see that where it says Abu al Hussein al Nuri, it says pi there. That should just be an A. I don't know why there's pi, but I'll fix that before I upload the slides. Okay, and here on the right is an image of a mystic in prayer, and his attendants are coming to him. And I always found this part about mystical exercise a little bit weird. Is that there's a lot of stories about how these mystics are poor and they uh, don't cultivate, any material goods and things. But yet, in almost all of the stories, like even in the stories of Rabia that we were telling a few weeks ago, she always seems to have attendance. And attendance is not having nothing, right? Attendance is having a whole lot of people that do all the stuff that you don't want to have to do, like bringing your food and washing your clothes and doing those sort of things. So there's often in these stories of saintly detachment, there's a whole lot of other people attached to the saint, even though the saint may not be attached to them. So that's what I was trying to show in this image from India on the right, is that the saint is sort of staring down, unattached, has the kind of halo or the glow of prophetic fire. Even the angels are his attendants in this case, but he is detached from all of them. And you're seeing the two sort of states, the saint in occlusion up on the right, who's alone by himself in a cave, and the saint on the left, who's about to be attended by these women or angels or hureya, dark-haired maidens with, in this case, depicted with wings, heavenly attendants. All right. Now, on to one particular person. Since every week we've been talking a little bit about a particular story of a particular figure, um, in this case, let's take a look at Ibn Arabi. So Ibn al-Arabi is a pretty important figure in terms of Sufism, but also generally in terms of Islamic mysticism and philosophy. And he comes up in a very exciting time. So he is an Andalusian scholar, which is to say he is born and bred in Spain, Muslim Spain in this case, in the Caliphate, that in the Syriac Caliphate. So um, the uh, the movement which sets up its suzerainty in a place like Spain, or what is modern day Spain, um, is very heavily influenced by the Syrian dynasties. That's where they draw their lineage from. And so, in a lot of cases in Andalusia, some of the most exquisite examples of Syrian architecture can actually be found in southern Spain, because they had extraordinary wealth and they were able to hire the very finest architects and scholars and philosophers from all over the Muslim world, and in particular from the milieu which they came from in Syria. So Ibn Arabi grows up around a period of intense study of, for example, Aristotle is being heavily studied at this time. The philosophy of Plato is going to be available at this time. In addition, he is encountering Christian mystics, and there's a series of Andalusian martyrs, Christians who are trying to get martyred by the state by saying blasphemies about Muhammad in public in Muslim lands, and so are being punished for that. And so he's seeing this kind of stuff happening. In addition, the level of sophistication of the society in Andalusia is quite exquisite, and so it's already quite a sophisticated intellectual milieu which he's going to come up in, and so he's going to be exposed to a lot of stuff. Now, Ibn Arabi, very early on in his life, has a mystical experience. He has an experience, he claims, at about 16 years old. And what happens is that he claims to have a vision where he encounters Jesus, Moses, and Al-Khidr, and lastly, the Prophet Muhammad himself. And in this account, he claims that Jesus comes to him and teaches him the perfection of monastic practice. So he claims, quote here, I have had many meetings with him in visions, and at his hands I turned to God. He prayed for me that I be established in religious life, in deen, both in this world and in the hereafter. And he called me beloved or Habib. He ordered me to practice renunciation, zuhud, and detachment, uh, tajrid. And so this is from the book The Unlimited Mercifier by Stephen Hirtenstein, and that's on page 53, that particular quote. And so renunciation and detachment here for Ibn Arabi is considered a prerequisite for the spiritual life. So if you want to embark on the spiritual path at all, this is the first stage. This is the first lesson that he learns from Jesus at 15 or 16. Then the next step is he's going to encounter Khidir or the green one, and Khidir is again we mentioned in the last class. He's it's implied that he is the servant of, or he is a servant of God who Moses encounters in the Quran, although his name is not associated with the account, but generally scholars have thought this to be the figure. But Khidir is also connected with Saint Gerges in and about Egypt, which is Saint George, who is also called Khidir, the Green. Now, whether or not it's the same figure or not, we're not 100% sure, but there seems to be a lot of claims on him asserted by both the Christians and the Muslims. So who he belongs to, I'm not sure. But in this particular case, in the vision that Ibn Arabi has, he belongs very much to the Muslim tradition. So when he encounters him, Khidir then teaches him about about how to then go to the next stage of practice, how to start opening the sort of mystical paths. And so for him, pure servanthood in this case means a disposition. And he says here, quote, ever since this station came upon me, I have not owned a single living thing, not even the clothes that I wear, for I wear nothing unless I'm specifically given permission to use it. Whenever I come to acquire something, I immediately part with it, either by giving it away or freeing it if it can be freed. This came about for me when I desired to realize the servanthood of exclusively belonging to God. And that was on page 54 of the same text. Okay. And in his final encounter during this mystical experience, he encounters the prophet, he claims. And he says the following happens. He says, I saw myself in a dream, and I was in a vast space. There was a group of armed men who wanted to kill me, and there was no way at all for me to escape. Then I saw from me, in front of me, a hill upon which the envoy of God, Muhammad, was standing and watching. So I took refuge with him. He opened his arms and embraced me fiercely, saying, my beloved, hold fast to me and you will be safe. Then I looked back at my assailants to find that there was not one of them left. It was from that time on that I occupied myself with the study of the Hadith. And so, for Ibn Arabi, the first stage is detachment. The next stage is how to sort of cultivate. Sorry, the first stage is the beginning of asceticism and renunciation. The second stage is how to cultivate non-attachment, and then the next stage is how to cling fast to the tradition of Muhammad. And for Ibn Arabi, he has a very particular approach to the Prophet. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay. So he says here about love. And Ibn Arabi is one of the figures who's pretty important from trying to argue that the Sufi approach to God assumes the primacy of love as opposed to the primacy of fear. Now, this is a bit of a dualism that has been forced into the tradition. The way that a good way to understand it is, in general, the response of people who think that they're going to be lifted from their graves, judged and evaluated, should be fear and trembling. Right. So, and often the prophetic encounter of the divine is described as terrifying. Right. That it's that the prophet describes at some instances, or his companions describe him almost fainting or almost falling over. Some Orientalists would take the rather extreme opinion of saying he's experiencing epileptic fits. But so the encounter of the divine is terrifying. And as we had described earlier in the Sirah of Muhammad, the experience of being squeezed by the angel was itself terrifying for him. And so Ibn Arabi, on the other hand, is narrating the traditions of love, is narrating the traditions of mercy. And here we'll see the way that he approaches it. So he'll say, quote, know that love is according to 3 degrees. Firstly, there is natural love, which is the love of ordinary people whose aim is unification in the animal spirit. It ends with physical union, which is the passion of love, and it spreads throughout the whole body. So this rather apparently is sex and desire, right? So this is the animal love would be the way that even the Greek would conceptualize it. Secondly, there is spiritual love of the soul, whose aim is becoming like the beloved and accomplishing what is the beloved's due and knowing his decree. And this, for someone like Ibn Arabi, is now enact the law. The Sharia becomes you, right? And then thirdly is divine love, which is the love of God for the servant and the love of servant for God. As in his words, and this is a quote from the Quran, he loves them and they love him. And so for Ibn Arabi, his theory is basically that when it comes to divine love, that on the first stage, the love that we can understand most easily is animal love, is the love for other people in the world with us, and desire and lust and what have you. The second kind of love is spiritual love, which is more elevated and refined through the studying of the traditions. And then the third is divine love, or in this case, union, in which the love of God and the servant uh, merges. Right. So, and that is the point of mystical union for Ibn Arabi. And he'll elaborate on this at great length in his discussion of the concept of Tawheed. Now, often when you hear the name Ibn Arabi, you will hear this term Wahdat al-Wajud. Now, I'm not going to get into that at any length right now, but to say that word does not show up in any of Ibn Arabi's writings. That's actually a criticism of him that was applied later. That concept is an interpretation of his understanding of Tawheed. And Tawheed, for us, those of us that may not remember, is the idea in Islam that God is one. And so Ibn Arabi begins to ask, well, what does oneness mean? What is the extent of the one? Does the one extend to everything in the universe? If so, is everything in the universe also God? And that's the line of questioning he goes down. And the kinds of conclusions that he reaches is the idea that the world is a mirror of the divine. And so, and since human beings have agency and choice, it is our responsibility to most perfectly reflect the divine. And so, the person who is the Insan al Kamil, who is the Ubermensch, for example, or the Superman, is going to be the person who most perfectly reflects the divine for Ibn Arabi, because once you are reflecting the divine perfectly, the distinction between the divine love and the servant's love is gone because it's merged. So for Ibn Arabi, the perfect person is the person who can achieve that stage. If that, I know this is a kind of, I see the furrowed brows. This is big think stuff, and it's a very complicated concept. And in general, the book on the right, the Revelations by Ibn Arabi, is between 34 and 36 volumes long, and it is in some of the most impenetrable Arabic ever written. So to this day, there is no translation available of it. Uh, Only bits have been translated because people give up. They have tried and they have worked at great length with his philosophy and then given up. And so the first annotated edition in Arabic did not come out until the 1920s, which is over nearly 1,000 years after he wrote it. So if this sounds complex, it is. It's very complicated. So this is a little gleaning of Ibn Arabi's thought. All right, let's move on to the next point here. As to his how Ibn Arabi classifies saints and prophets, which will help us understand what's going on for today's class. So here is a quote from him from the Meccan openings. Between prophethood and sainthood exists a distinction, yet the former has the more complete and supreme honor. So prophets are the highest rank. The all embracing sphere of heaven kneels to it in its innermost secret, as does the high ranking pen. Now, the pen here is mentioned specifically because in the Quran, God is said to have taught human beings by the pen. Okay, so that's why he's mentioning the pen here. So, prophethood and envoyship came into existence. Now it has ended, and there lies a straight way. Okay, so this is Ibn Arabi recognizing the prophets have ended with Muhammad. Next, he has built a solid house. So God has built a solid house for sainthood in his essence, and it remains forever. Do not seek an end in striving for it. By its attainment, you would be demolished, fana, annihilated. The quality of permanence belongs to his essence itself. He is the friend and director. His conquering power holds sway. His envoy and his prophet take shelter in him and the highest universe and that in which is more ancient. So, again, let us explain. What Ibn Arabi is saying in a certain way is with the death of the last prophet, with the death of Muhammad, the message is complete. And the synthesis of knowledge of the divine is complete in Muhammad and in the Quran. But are there those who can access that same plane of revelation as the prophets may have accessed through devotion, through love of God? And to him, my suspicion would be yes. So what the saints are doing in Ibn Arabi's understanding is that the saint is occupying the space of the constant ongoing revelation of God in the world today. So, one of the problems when Muhammad dies, and in the same way when Jesus dies, it creates an existential crisis for the community. What are we now? Right? So, in the period right after the death of Muhammad, we have a lot of people, especially certain Bedouin tribes, who try to withdraw their oaths of allegiance to Muhammad. They say, we swore oaths with him, he's dead, so we're done. We're going to walk away. This leads to the so-called Rida wars in the aftermath, in the period of early Islam, in which a lot of people die trying to fight over whether or not is the allegiance to Muhammad and the community of Muhammad and the religion of Muhammad severable by his death, is the question that's maybe asserted in that time period. And what we see is a certain anxiety. Without the prophet here, without the direct conduit to God in our presence, how then can we keep the religion vitalized? How then does it stay alive in the world? And to the mind of Ibn Arabi, his argument is it is the saints that keep the religion alive. Because the saints are still our conduits to God, but whereas the prophet is the highest in rank and has a message for all peoples, and Prophet Muhammad has the like final message for all peoples, and Ibn Arabi will make a distinction between Nabi and Rasul, which is a technical point, and I won't go too much into it right now. But the what he is arguing is that the prophets who come with giving messages from God and giving systems of life from God have ended with Muhammad. but the ongoing relationship between God and humans is continued through the saints and continued through these figures who we can still access the divine through. And so he creates a special category in his cosmology for saints to be a kind of the active participant in God if the rest of us can't access God directly. Now, from a conservative person or a conservative scholar would say, but you're accessing God every time you pray. So why do you need these saints and all of these other people? And that is a damn good question, right? But in the case of the saints, the belief is that their piety, their baraka, their blessings, their very presence is something exquisite for the community, and it's recognizable in the life of the saint that they have importance, they have beauty, they have love, they have a certain connection which is noticed by everyone around them, and it's sort of undeniable to the people who are in their presence. And so, as a result, even very conservative scholars at the turn of right around the year 1000 are conscious of the fact that they can't just slander these guys because so many local people have fallen madly in love with their understanding of the faith or the way that they were taught the religion by them. And so even by the 10th century, we have a real crisis taking place here. The cults of the saints is where the religion is alive and vibrant, and the libraries of the scholars is where it's dead and on the written word and its contemplation through it. And so these two extremes of Islamic practice are going to become more and more apparent, right? So on the one hand, you can go to the saint shrine and participate in what they are saying is the continual lively tradition, whereas here you're studying the texts of the past, studying taqlid, imitation of the scholars of the past on how to apply rulings and things like that. And so Ibn Arabi is pointing to that tension between these two extremes. So, of prophets, he will have the following to say, and this is one of his books, which is translated by Benjamin Abrahamov, and it's a very good translation. And it's about the bezels of wisdom. And if you look at this text, it's subdivided into each of the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran and some that aren't. And so each of the prophets that are mentioned, Ibn Arabi believes that every prophet comes in, has a specific message for a specific time and place. So, for example, when Jesus appears on the scene, he is appearing for a specific peoples in a specific time and place in a specific language. And that's kind of the way that the Quran understands the prophets in general, is the idea that God is attempting to communicate with humanity throughout time and so sends prophets. The first prophet, most would argue, is Adam. And then in time, different prophets come to different communities. So Moses comes to the Israelites and gives them the law, right? So that would be an example of a specific prophet in history, although his book culminates, the final chapter of his book is on Muhammad. And his argument is, and Ibn Arabi has a kind of a weird understanding of Muhammad. Muhammad exists before any of the other prophets, before Adam, and also is the final prophet. What he means is that God has a plan. And in the plan, the idea that Muhammad would receive this revelation is at the beginning of time. And so when Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, Ibn Arabi argues that Muhammad completes the circle of prophethood, that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the final prophet and the culmination of all revealed knowledge. And so for Ibn Arabi, there is no need for there to be any other prophet after Muhammad because all the knowledge is already contained. But then why do we have saints? And so this is what he'll argue about the saints. What he means by saints is someone who sees the true realities of things directly in their own experience by virtue of their realizing the complete dependence upon God. Or someone who acts through what he knows of the details of revealed law and who has firm faith in what the envoys and the sacred books have brought. Then God lifts the veil from his inner vision and makes him a possessor of the inner vision in his affairs, just as he did with the prophet and the messenger and the people to whom he was solicitous. So, in the case for Ibn Arabi, now keep in mind, let's take a step back. If we are in a dream world, if the reality around us is not real, because we don't have direct physical access to the prophets today, Robert, yes, women can be saints. Rabia, we had mentioned before, is a saint, and there's a few other important ones in Iran as well. And I'll be happy to discuss them in future classes when we cover those subjects as well. But Rabia is the kind of most important. Rabia al-Basri is the most important female saint. I would argue in Islam. But so what Ibn Arabi is arguing here is that the prophets do the big work, and then the little work of reminding us that the really real is hidden behind a veil. And often the Quran, even in the tradition, is referred to as a veiled text. So the idea that the people who can see behind the veil are our guides, that's Ibn Arabi's concept of the saint. The saint is the living embodiment of the ability to see beyond the veil. And so the saint is special and worthy and important because, at least in Ibn Arabi's understanding, it's the person who sees the really real. And so your guidance by a saint. So were you to go seek a saint for help if you were having an existential crisis? What am I? What is the world? What is the universe? A saint would be sort of uniquely positioned to help you, if that would make sense, because they have transcended the bonds. They have stopped seeing the illusion and they have started seeing the real. And so contact with them would be the contact with a conduit to the unseen. Um, if I know that that's very complicated, it's difficult to understand, but in a way, if you were to look at it in the sort of Catholic tradition as well, it's the way that the religion stays alive and lively. So let's say, for example, you live in Aleppo. It's the 1900s. You live in Aleppo, and a local person. Who has studied the Quran, studied in a local religious school, has now taken a bit of an oath of renunciation, and he started to live in a cave just outside the city. And people visit him and they ask him to teach them Quranic interpretation. They ask him questions about their life. And everyone regards him as being a very pious figure. That he doesn't take money from anybody. He doesn't embezzle. He's sitting in retreat most of his life and most of his day, and he says really profound stuff when you go and talk to him. And over time, people would begin to venerate him. And then when he dies on that spot, you would build a little shrine to him, a shrine that might look something like the one I showed you earlier. Like, for example, this shrine was built when a saint appeared in this community and he claimed to have been dropped there by the angels. And so he said, the angels came and put me in the spot which I was going to die. And so he remained there. And then eventually, when he died, they built the shrine over his tomb. And so his claim is, or Ibn Arabi's argument is, that the saint is the reminder that the divine is out there because this person has transcended the bonds of rational understanding and the ability to see beyond the seen. And so as a result, this person is not a substitute for our striving, right? Like the presence of this person will not save me. This person will not drag me to heaven on their own, even though some saints claim to do that. But this person is a reminder in the same way that the prophet is a reminder that there is a real beyond the real, because this is the person who lives in that existence. And so the encounter with them is a reminder to me in my own life that that is conceivable, that that is possible, right? And so the saint for Ibn Arabi is extremely important because even though the time of prophets has ended with Muhammad, the ones who can come closest to the prophetic understanding, i.e., understand the truth, the haq, the hakika behind the really real, are where you go. That's when you need to go to the saints. And in some cases, no, I think that that's a good point to stop. So let's then say, what, right? So how does this work? How do people narrate it in their stories? How do they talk about saints? Let me tell you a story about how saints matter. Okay, so there was a 10th century group called the Ikhwan al-Safa, and they were uh, a weird group in Basra who were anonymous. They did not, their names are not well known, or we can't confirm who they were. But they were extremely well read. And keeping in mind, in Basra, about a generation earlier, a mass translation and printing of Greek texts was suddenly embarked upon. So a lot of Greek philosophy, in particular Aristotle and Plato, and some of the Neoplatonic schools have become available. In addition, Khalila wa Dimna, the stories of the ring dove cycle, have come from the Mahabharata in India. So stories from the traditions in India have been narrated into the Indo-Persian tradition, and then have by this point made it over the Basra. They're extremely popular stories about animals in which animals come together to defeat humans. So, in the case where humans put a trap out to catch an animal, other animals will work together to sabotage the trap to keep the dove free or what have you. So, in these stories, these Ikhwana Safa, they find a real kinship with these animals because the animals, in their understanding, are struggling together to achieve liberation, right? So in a certain way, it's they are imitating our own struggle, is their kind of thinking. So they draw upon Greek philosophy, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and other philosophical systems in the area when they write this epistle. So there's a number of epistles. They have, I think, 52 in total, but epistle number 22 in particular is the Arabic critical edition. It's a very, really beautiful. And the first half of the text is the book in English, and the second half of the text is the same book again in Arabic from the other direction. So it's a very like nice tome to have. But let me tell you about the story contained therein. So human beings, there's an island somewhere we don't know. And so a lot of these kind of mystic stories begin like this, right? There's an island somewhere. And the king of the island is named Biswarap, and he's a jinn. And he's claimed to be a jinn who's the highest ranked amongst the jinn. And the jinn, for those of us who may not be familiar, are said to be spirits of fire in the Quran who are not angelic. So angels are servants of God in the sense that an angel cannot refuse a command of God. And the next below, sort of in rank, descending to human beings, may be the jinn. And the jinn are said to have supernatural powers. But in the same way that Muhammad is sent as an envoy to humans, he is also considered to be a mercy to all the world. So to the jinn as well, is Muhammad is meant to have some sway over them. In the same way, in the stories, Suleiman or the prophet Solomon has command over the jinn as well. In a lot of the stories, Suleiman has jinn servants. So in the king of this island is Biswarap, and he has maintained animals here in a state of non-domination. So the animals have just done whatever they want with the island. They live in peace. They're not captured. They're not caught. They're not. And there's a sense that maybe even there isn't predation taking place here. That everyone's just living happily. And a shipwreck happens, and a bunch of men come off the ship and immediately start capturing the animals, eating them, trapping them, and what have you. And so the animals get fed up, and they go to the court of the king Biswarap, and they sue the human beings, and they say, "We would like the human beings to tell us on what basis they claim dominion over us. Why do they have command over us?" And so the complaints go something like this. Here's the complaint of the ram. The ram says, You would have pitied us, your majesty, had you seen us as their prisoners, when they seized our smallest kids and lambs and tore them from their dams to steal our milk. They took our young and bound them hand and foot to be slaughtered and skinned, hungry, thirsty, bleeding for mercy but unpitied, screaming for help with none to aid them. We saw them slaughtered, flayed, dismembered, disemboweled, their heads, brains, and livers on butcher's blocks to be cut up with great knives and boiled in cauldrons or roasted in an oven, while we kept silent, not weeping or complaining, for even if we had wept, they would not have pitied us. Where is their mercy? So the accusation that the animals are making is that human beings are not merciful, which is one of the traits of God in the Quran. So, if human beings are not merciful, on what basis, on what claim do they have authority over us? So the animals are told, well, why don't you bring representatives from each of the animal kingdoms? So the animals go out and gather from the beasts of the sea, they gather from the flying insects, they gather from the four legged animals, from predators, etc. Each of the animals sends forward kind of a lawyer or a representative to go and argue in this case. And the humans do the same thing. Each of the nations sends a representative to represent themselves in the case. So animals are arguing that they should be set free and that God has not given human beings dominion over animals. The human beings' claim is that Adam was charged with naming the animals and placed at the head of them. And so, because Adam gets that claim, that human beings have a right to animals, all animals. And the jinn are kind of stuck in a middle position because the jinn agree that the humans are being extremely unjust towards the animals. However, if they set the animals free secretly at night, which is what one of the advisors said to do, he says, why don't you just go open up the cages late at night? The jinn say the human beings will come together and they'll kill us too. And so the danger is that the human beings have become capricious in their use of violence, that their only claim of dominion over animals has become one of physical claim. So the story is locked in this tension where there can be no budge on either side. And then finally, one of the humans steps forward. And let me tell you what he has to say for himself. Okay. Um, At that, the orator from the Hijaz, from Mecca and Medina, rose and said, quote, Your Majesty, we have other virtues and distinctions which show that we are lords and these animals are our slaves, and we are their masters and owners. What are they? Says the king. The promises that our Lord gave us, that we of all beings will be resurrected and raised up, brought forth from our graves, and dealt with on the reckoning day of the day of judgment, and admitted to the straight path and entered into paradise, the lovely garden, the eternal garden, the Garden of Eden, the garden of sanctuary, the realm of peace and abiding, the abode of the faithful, the tree of beatitude, the spring of Sasabil, the rivers of wine, of honey, of milk, and pure water, with tiered palaces and dark maidens to wife, and God close by, all merciful, all glorious, all bountiful, and the scent of the breeze and the verdure, all described in the Quran in some 700 verses. All this these animals lack. And it shows that we are masters and they are slaves. We have the further distinction too that would take too long to list. And I have said all that I may say. God grant pardon to me and you. At this point, the delegates of the birds, the nightingale rose and says, It may be true, human, but bear in mind that the rest of the promise of, quote, O humans, chastisement in the grave, an interrogation of the angels, and the terrors of judgment day, the strict reckoning, the threat of flames and the torments of hell and the blazing hellfire, the shirts of pitch, pus to drink, the tree of Zakum, the master of wrath standing by, the gatekeepers of fire, all this is for you and not for us. We are exempt. We have no promised reward, but we face no threat of retribution. We accept the Lord's judgment, neither for or against us. He withheld the blessing of his promise, but spared us the dread of his threat. So the evidence is balanced. You and I stand on equal footing with us, and you have no advantage. How can we be equal? Demanded the humans. How can we stand on par when we have prophets And we have devisees, imams, sages, poets, paragons of goodness, virtue, and saints as their seconds, ascetics pure and righteous, figures of piety, insight, understanding, awareness, and vision, who are like the angels on high. They quest after the highest goods, yearn for their Lord, return to Him in all things, and even hearken to Him. They look to Him, contemplate His greatness and His splendor, trust Him in all things, beseech Him alone, seek Him alone, and hope for Him alone, since their care is His dread. The animal delegates and the genie sages all agreed. Ah, humans, now you have finally come to the truth. You have spoken well and answered right, for what you claim is something indeed to take pride in. The lives and characters of saintly persons, their manners and thoughts, the studies in which they are versed, and indeed worth vying for. But tell us, O humans, the qualities and lives of these persons, inform us of their insights, of their virtues, and of godly things. If you know aught of them, enlighten us. If you can, what is a saint? The whole body fell silent, contemplating the question, and none had an answer. Finally, arose a learned, accomplished, worthy, keen, and pious and insightful man. He was Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, a Hanif, a regal character by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in lore, Christian in manner, Damascene in devotion, Greek in science, and Indian in discernment. Sufi in intimation, regal in character, masterful in thought, and divine in awareness. And he praised God, Lord of all the worlds, and said, "The destiny of the faithful and the foe to be none but the unjust. God bless the seal of the prophets, the foremost of God's messengers, Muhammad, God's elect, and all his worthy house and good nations. The saints of God are the flower of creation, the best and the purest, the persons of fair and praiseworthy parts, pious deeds, myriad sciences, godly awareness, regal character, just and holy lives, and awesome ways, fluent tongues, wary to name their qualities, and none has adequately described their innermost core. Many have cited their virtues, and preachers at public assemblies have devoted their lives down through the ages to sermons dilating on their merits and their godly ways without ever reaching the pith of the matter. Period. That's the conclusion of the story. So uh, the 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 point I'm trying to make is in a 10th century text where we have humans and animals competing for who has the right to be free or who has the right to be slave, the animals are saying, you have no claim over us. And ultimately, because the animals are also alleging that all the prophets are gone, so who's meant to come and set you humans right? And the claim finally is that it is the saints. It is the saints that make human beings good itself, is what the Ikhwan are going to argue here. That it is that human beings have the capacity to be both saint and devil. And if we choose to be devil, then we will brutally mistreat animals. And if we choose to be like the saints or emulate the saints, the flowers of creation in this case, then we will be closer to the divine or closer to God or closer to emulating upright behavior. And so, what you finding even in these stories about sort of the meta saints, the idea is that the saint is the constant representative of the covenant between God and humans, because the saint is the one who is allowed into the inner chamber and lives to tell us about it. And so, for the Sufis in particular, the saints will become an object of some considerable importance and will get co opted by the larger Sufi tradition. The saints may not themselves claim to be Sufi, but the Sufis will certainly claim the saints, right? And the way that they do it is in texts like Attar, like we were talking about in previous classes. When Attar writes his biographies of the saints into a single tome, what he is also doing is he is marshaling all of these envoys or all of these greatly regarded figures from the past as an argument in his favor. He is trying to say all of these figures, they are all Sufis, and that is an argument that he is making by sort of mashing all of these stories into his books on the prophets and saints. So, I mean, ultimately, uh, the ending of the story is not, it doesn't sound very satisfying to us, right? So when we're reading it as a modern, we're like, these animals have spent 100 pages complaining about how horribly humans treat them, and the conclusion is the humans just say the word saints and everybody shuts up. That doesn't make any damn sense. But you have to shift our subject position. We have to shift into a position in which that answer is a satisfactory answer. And so when we move into the state in which the saying that human beings have saints that makes all human beings worthy understands for a moment what a 10th century Iraqi may have thought about the saints, that the saints are argument enough that humanity has not reached a corrupted, entirely corrupted state, that we have not in a fallen state in this world because of the presence of these figures that keep reminding us of the reality beyond the real. And what you're seeing largely in the modern period is a shift away from the cults of saints and localized practice more to an international form of Islam that believes in the um, ready translatability and understandability of the Quran and the Hadith traditions. So, whereas in the past, your understanding would have been drawn from study of the Quran and encounters and learnings at the saint shrines, in the modern period, it's to shift away from that more to a textualized form of Islam, which focuses primarily on the Quran and the kind of Sahih Hadith traditions. Okay, I've said plenty for today. Do we have any any questions, any thoughts at this stage before we wind down a little bit? Oh, just forgive me 1 second. Let me um, say that Devin, I looked into the Iblis Shaitan thing that we talked about last week. And what I could find was pretty unsatisfactory. But what generally I found was that Iblis is used as a personified form of the so-called shaitan. So shaitan is conceptualized as an adversary for human beings in all ways. So any evil is shaitan. However, Iblis is the personified form, and because it is personified, he has a nature and a character that is separate from just evil generally. So, and because he has choice and agency, and then he's also judged to be arrogant in the Quran, the idea is that he, as an individual actor, has his own character and his own nature, and he has his own design. But the shaitan, as is otherwise described in the Quran, is just anything that misleads from the path. But is not caused by the personified devil. So, whereas in Christianity, any evil act could ultimately be the fault of Lucifer and his goons, in Islam, it's not necessarily the fault of the personified Iblis. It is just things that mislead you from the path, if that were to make sense. Um, any other questions? The world is veiled. Yeah, Peyton. There's a saying by Rumi in which he tries to make sense of understanding the world as veiled. And he says at one point, I was raw, then I was cooked, and now I am burned. And literally he is saying about this, about the stages of the path, are that I, in the raw state, I'm in my animal kind of bestial state. In the cook state, I've become perfected by learning the law and study, and in the burn state is I've now gone beyond, and I have become useless as food, and now I'm useful as fuel for the flame, almost, right? So it's that's the kind of way that Rumi conceptualizes it, and and we're going to spend some time with Rumi in future weeks, it's so his way of speaking about that is really beautiful. It's kind of
I found it
was it?
really interesting.
Oh, great. Well,
Yeah.
Ibn Arabi is his idea of the dream um, is very interesting, because even Shunzi, he has a Chinese philosopher, once has a dream in which he was a butterfly, and then when he wakes up, he says, "I now no longer know if I dreamt I was a butterfly or I am now a butterfly dreaming that it's a human being." That the and that's the kind of space that the dream occupies. Is that dream is the space of the imagination, which
Mhm.
can lead us to learning and knowledge which may not be readily available through rational sciences. Which is why, since the very early on in Islam, there has been a special kind of attention to dream. And so dream manuals are something that have became very, very popular. And in fact, if you were to go to almost any shrine in a major place like Egypt, in Cairo, for example, every shrine that you go to, Sufi shrine, will sell dream manuals and interpretation manuals there. And actually, a scholar by the name of Amira Mittermeier at U of T has written a book on dream interpretation and compared Sufi dream interpretation to Jungian and Freudian dream interpretation. So, if that is a subject of interest to you, her book "Dreams That Matter" is very, very good.
I like how you paid attention to like how saints kind of see beyond the veil too, and like the dream interpretation, just as you discussed that. Like I like the philosophy behind it too, so it was very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very seductive idea, and in
Hmm.
certain ways, the Quran is pushing you to start thinking of the world as either a test or as a dream or
Hmm.
as not being really important. That what's really, really important is the stuff that's contained in the text, how it's explaining the universe, relationships, and what have you, and everything else in our reality is kind of either a test or a misleading of us. And so the description of the dreamer waking up to the really
Hmm.
real is works for
Yeah,
us, because
yeah.
I mean, if any of us have felt that sense of being really disoriented when you've woken up from a very vivid dream where you don't know where you are or what you're doing, that's that kind of liminal state that Ibn Arabi is focusing on.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I got a quick question.
Please.
In terms of the concept of a covering or veil, would the word that they are referring to be rishawa? Rishawa?
Oh boy, you stuck me again. All right, next week you'll have
Okay,
an
okay, okay.
answer.
Because I know in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 7, it says that the people have usually the word is rishawa, which is like they have a covering over their hearing and their vision, but it's like a division between the munafiqun, like the hypocrites, and then the
would
everyone
you
else,
would you
basically,
mind
right?
would you mind
Oh,
spelling it for me real quick, Devin?
uh,
It's just in Arabic, if you don't mind.
yeah, Rishawa is a Ghain, Sheen, Aleph,
Yeah.
Wow, and a Ta marbuta.
Okay. Thank you.
It's at the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, like ختم الله على قلوبهم وعلى سمعهم وعلى أبصارهم غشاوة ولهم عذاب عظيم.
Okay.
Um,
Awesome.
yeah, but sorry, but because it's usually it's like it just means to cover, but it's usually translated as like a veil or something like that. It's
Hmm.
not really anyway. So, but I was wondering if that's the word they're using or not, though. It's like I don't know. Sure.
Sure, sure. I'll give you an exact answer to that. You know, there is an article that was, I remember, from the Oxford Handbook on Sufism about the veiled text, and I'll
Mhm.
give you the exact explanation as is in that article. I seem to recall that one, and also, if you would like, I'll post that article
Oh yes, please,
on
yes, please. Thank you
Brightspace,
so
so it's
much.
available too. Yeah, anytime you hear me mention something like a specific text, if you guys are interested in that text, and if I have a copy of it, I would be more than happy to post it on Brightspace for you.
Mhm.
So just let me know.
So
Okay.
much.
Is the term? I see also a question from Margaret Lucas asking, is the term ultimate reality out of fashion? Um, it depends who you're talking to, I guess, Margaret. My suspicion is the ultimate reality. It does sound a bit old-fashioned. I guess what ruins it is superhero movies. They use ultimate a lot, and they kind of ruin the word. The word ultimate is the one that's been ruined there, as opposed to reality. Um, so, in the sense of the ultimate reality, as is understood by scholars such as Ibn Arabi, the ultimate reality would be the face of the beloved, right? And they would describe it in terms of when the Quran refers to everything being gone or everything being destroyed at the end of days except for the face of God. They would say that is the only ultimate reality, is that, and everything other than that is derivative, or alternatively, if you were to look at Neoplatonic philosophy and emanationism, and I will spend a little bit of time with that because that was the kind of one bit I didn't mention about the Ikhwana Safa, is that they're sometimes considered to be Neoplatonists in terms of how emanationism operates. But if you look at mystical maps, you'll see, especially by the Gnostics, by Neoplatonists, and by scholars in the Muslim Neoplatonic understanding, is that it'll be circles drawn within circles with larger and larger and larger circles, and within each circle would be reality as you would apprehend it if you reach that level of understanding. So the really real would be right in the middle of the circle, and each stage outside of it would be the maximal level of your understanding if you were to only go that far. So, for example, a rational understanding would only take you to a certain point. After rational understanding, you have to have something deeper, and then after that deeper point is then entry into the state of annihilation or fana in the divine. And so in that stage, there's a mystical union with the divine. And at that point, it's as close as you could conceivably get in life. Until death and ascension to heaven or what have you. But ultimate reality, yeah, I guess perhaps slightly out of fashion in English, but still very useful as a term, or the really real at the very least. All right. Well, thanks again, guys. And we're moving forward into our next chapter with Ernst, which is going to be discussing mystical experience. So we're going to be spending more time with that in the next class, and it'll give us an opportunity to talk about veiling and veiled as well at that point. So again, thank you for your time, energy, and for your faces that you are sharing more often with me now, because man, does that help in terms of delivering the content. So thank you. Have a wonderful week, and please note that my office hours and stuff are now linked with Calendly online. If you want to book some time to talk with me, discuss any ideas that you have for your final papers and projects, just so we can start the conversation. Please feel free to book time, and the easiest time to book me is sort of right after class. We can sit and chat, but also if you go to my booking page, you can figure out when I'm available. All right. So thank you, everyone. And I love the cats on camera. I had to, I don't know if you heard mine from the first half of class, he was howling because I got into the habit of brushing him right before I start teaching. And so I didn't do it today, and he remembered. And so he stood and cried at the bottom of the stairs until in the break, I spent the whole 10 minutes just running over him with the brush. And then he settled down. He's got a particular brush. He hates every brush in the house except for the brush which I had isolated to remove his fur from my jacket. That became the brush he most wanted. So he's claimed it now, and he's rubbed his chin on it to the point that it's his. So so be it. Anyway, see you all. I'll drag Ludo onto camera someday.
Oh
His
yes,
name
yes, please, yes, please.
his name means I play, or in Latin. So we'll pull him on sometime. All right. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
See you next week. Thank you so much.